This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Chapter 9, Law of the Pack. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Rudyard Kipling. It was well after dark when Will pulled into his small apartment on Bland Avenue. It was an old 2-story house that had been converted into apartments many years before. The once dark blue paint was fading with time and the siding had seen better days, but it was still a nice place. Will pulled around to the back of the small gravel parking lot reserved for tenants. There were several cars already parked back there and he recognized all of them, except for one. It was a Jeep Wrangler Unlimited Rubicon with Missouri tags, and the cop in him immediately noticed the barcode sticker in the back window and the Enterprise Cars bracket around the license plate. That's not normal, Will thought, as he took a parking spot beneath a large oak and shut the engine down. Climbing out, he grabbed the duffel bag from the seat beside him and picked up the Beowulf, instinctively placing his finger alongside the trigger guard instead of on it, then holding it with the barrel down and across his chest. There was no one outside to notice, but he swept the parking lot and yard like he had cleared areas back in Afghanistan. He was confident that his grandfather's spirit bag would work, but there was no such thing as being too cautious. On the contrary, complacency would get you killed. Moving around to the northwest side of the building, he headed for his small efficiency apartment. It consisted of a living room that doubled as a bedroom, a small bathroom, and an even smaller kitchen. It wasn't much, and he didn't need more than that. He froze when he saw a figure sitting on the front steps of his apartment. The figure was silhouetted against the streetlight in front of the house. They were wearing khaki cargo pants, desert-style combat boots, and a dark-colored fleece pullover. The figure had a dark black beard and wore a khaki-colored ball cap. At his hip, Will could see the tip of a concealed holster. When the light revealed his face, he recognized him instantly. "Doc," he said, lowering the rifle that he hadn't realized he'd been bringing up. "What are you doing here?" "Hey," said Doc, standing up and smiling. "You always come home with an AR in your hand? This must be a rougher town than it looks like." Will smiled as he approached. The two old soldiers didn't shake hands. They hugged like long-lost brothers. "Holy shit," said Will. "What are you doing here? That's a hell of a jump from Colorado." "After I got off the phone with you, I couldn't shake the conversation," explained Doc. "I pulled the kits and told Angie I'd be back in a few days. Once I told her what you had said, she told me to be careful and not go unarmed." "Well, how did you get here so fast?" asked Will, unlocking the apartment. "I have a buddy who runs a charter service out of Boulder," explained Doc. "Well, I called him and he picked me up. I loaded up my gear and flew into Springfield, and I rented that Jeep because I refused to take one of those stupid sedans they always carry." "Well, I'm shocked you didn't get a Humvee," said Will, opening the door. "They didn't have one," said Doc, chuckling. "Come on inside," said Will, holding the door open. They stepped inside the spartanly furnished apartment. There was a bed with military-style hospital corners on the edge, one small couch and chair facing a television that was about the size of a computer monitor, a small desk with a single laptop sitting on it, and a dresser. "Nice place," said Doc. "You know you're not in the Army anymore, right?" "Old habits die hard," said Will. "Hey, you want a beer?" "Absolutely," replied Doc. Will ducked into the tiny kitchen, which was followed by the sound of 2 caps being removed from the bottles. Moments later, he returned with 2 brown bottles of Boulevard Wheat beer. "You ever had one of these?" asked Will, handing one to Doc. "Can't say that I have," replied Doc. "They're made in Kansas City," said Will. "It's good stuff." They toasted each other and clinked bottles together, and they nodded. "Two absent friends," said Doc. "Absent friends," agreed Will. Both men took a long pull of their beers before continuing. "Now this isn't bad," said Doc. "Oh, they're better with food," Will answered, taking another sip. "So," said Doc. "So?" asked Will with a shrug. "What are you doing here?" "I brought you the kits," said Doc, chuckling and taking another swig of beer. "You could have FedExed them," said Will. "You didn't have to make the trip." "I know I didn't," said Doc, grinning, "but if you aren't sure what you're facing here, then I figured you could use some help. I loaded up my gear and I headed here." "Now these things are dangerous," said Will. "These things," replied Doc. "I thought you said it was just one." "Well, I thought it was," said Will. "I just found out a little while ago that there are more of them." "Well, crap," said Doc. "Now that ups the ante. It's probably a good thing I came then. Sounds like you're going to need a medic." "What are you carrying?" asked Will. "I've got my SIG P320 compact 9mm on my hip," said Doc. "My AR's in the bag. I got a couple of Gerber combat knives with me, all 5 feet 6 inches and 170 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal." "Well, at least you brought your guns," said Will, chuckling. "Ouch," replied Doc, laughing. "What's your AR rig set up?" asked Will. "She's a custom Noveski and 223 Wild," said Doc, smiling. "M4 2000 suppressor, aim point micro T1 optic with a Surefire Mini Scout light, all Magpul furniture and PMags." "Well, that's nice, but I think you're going to need something heavier than a 5.56mm, said Will. "I've got a 50 cal Beowulf, and I hope it's big enough to stop these things." "Jesus, dude," said Doc. "If the Beowulf won't stop it, we're going to have to call in a damn artillery strike. I know a guy at Fort Sill who crews 155mm. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that," said Will. "If it takes something that big to stop these things, then we're in a lot of trouble." "Now that's a fact," said Doc. "When do we get started?" "Carrie, I can't ask you to get involved with this," said Will, shaking his head. "You have no idea how dangerous these things are." "I know, and for the record, you didn't ask," said Doc. "What kind of friend would I be if I let you do this alone? A damn shitty one, brother. I know it's dangerous, but that's why I came. I've got your back." "If anything happens to you, Angie will kill me," said Will. "You are aware of that, right?" "Well, she'll kill us both," said Doc. "But she also knows that there's no way I'll walk away without doing everything I can to help you." "All right," said Will. "If you're going to use that rifle, we'd better get you some armor-piercing ammo and maybe some tracers." "Fair enough," said Doc. "How about loading some Dragon's Breath rounds in that shotgun? I don't care how tough you are. No one likes getting their ass set on fire." "Oh, that's a good plan," said Will. Before he could say anything else, Will's cell phone began to ring. It was a song that made Doc smile. It was Copperhead Road by Steve Earle. "Graygle," said Will, answering the phone and ending the song. "Will," said the anxious-sounding voice of Mike Blanchard, "we've got a problem." "What's up?" asked Will, his tone growing serious. "The little bastard called in a few minutes ago, and he said he was checking a suspicious animal out on Kinfolk Road near Prosperine River access." "Well, what did he find?" said Will, fear rising in his voice. "Well, I don't know," replied Mike. "He hasn't checked in since. We're mobilizing units to head out that way. Dispatch said he described the animal as a big wolf. Sounds like our friend is back." "I'm on my way," said Will. "I'll head straight out there." Will hung up the phone and started grabbing his gear. "Game time," said Will. "We've got an officer missing. Let's grab your gear and get moving." "It's already loaded in the Jeep," said Doc. "Let's just take it." "The Charger's faster," replied Will. "Besides that, the Jeep doesn't have emergency lights. Mine does." Well, let's get the gear moved over and hit the road, said Doc. Grabbing their coats, they ran out the door and around the back of the building. Doc headed straight for the back of the Jeep while Will opened the back door of the Charger. And in seconds, they transferred 2 large bags of gear and 4 boxes of medical kits into the back. Seconds later, he was firing up the big V8 engine and backing out of the driveway. Doc started loading weapons and slipping into his plate carrier, and they were already moving in excess of 60 miles an hour in a residential area when Will hit the red, white, and blue emergency lights. He engaged the siren and slid around a corner and onto a commercial street, slowing down only briefly at each intersection to make sure that it was clear, and he kept up the speed until taking a hard right onto Jefferson Avenue and heading out of town. "How far away are we?" asked Doc. 15 minutes, said Will. "Little less if we don't run into traffic." Reaching for the mic on his radio, he called into dispatch. 636, he said. "Go ahead, 636, came an instant response. "Show me en route to Kinfolk Road," he said. "Proceeding code 1 response." "Copy that, 636, said dispatch. "Next available unit is on the far side of Sleeper. You'll be the first on scene." "Solid copy," said Will. 636 out. They rocketed past the intersection of 3rd Street and Jefferson, and they saw a much newer Charger slide sideways into the road behind him. Just then his radio came to life. 625, said the voice of Mike Blanchard. "Go ahead, 625, said dispatch. "Same traffic as 636, he said. "I'm right behind him now." "Copy, 625, said dispatch. "Be advised that car 1 will be joining you. He's en route from his residence in Phillipsburg." "Copy that," replied Blanchard. 625 out. 636, said Will again. "Go ahead, 636, said dispatch. "Advise Dallas County we might have an officer down situation and request response," said Will, "if they're available." "The call's already been made, 636, said dispatch. "Their only unit on tonight is on a call, but we'll respond as soon as he's clear." "Copy," said Will. 636 out. "Looks like it's just us and the guy behind us," said Doc. "Mike Blanchard," said Will. "He's a good guy and he already knows what we're up against." "Well, that's good," said Doc. They rode in silence as Will concentrated on the road ahead. They followed Highway 64 out west of town until it intersected with State Road AA. Rubber squealed in protest as Will fishtailed around the corner. A quick glance in the mirror showed that Blanchard was still behind him but had taken the corner a little slower. It didn't take the newer Charger Interceptor Hemi engine long to catch back up to him. The minutes ticked by, and they could hear the radio traffic as other units checked in, and dispatch continued to try and get a response from McKelvey without success. Slowing down only for the corners, Will pushed the big engine as hard as he could in the straightaways. For the most part, Blanchard was able to stay right on his heels. As they left State Road AA and moved on to Kinfolk Road, the pavement ended. They had to slow their approach due to the loose gravel of the road. "Get ready," Will said after several minutes had passed. "That's the old Prosperine Church on your right. It's all gravel from here. We're less than a minute out." "Lock and load," said Doc, chambering around in his AR. As they rounded the corner, they could see the flashing red, white, and blue lights of an emergency vehicle just ahead. Will began decelerating and Blanchard matched his velocity. Sliding to a stop right behind the Lackland County cruiser that was sitting in the middle of the road with its lights flashing and the driver's side door standing open, Will threw the car in park and leapt out of the door, grabbing the Beowulf as he went. They could hear the radio come to life. 625 to dispatch, said Blanchard. "Show myself in 636 out at 613's location." "Copy that, 625, said dispatch. "Next available unit is still at least 10 minutes behind you." Doc followed suit and came around the front of the car with his rifle up, advancing tactically and sweeping the ditch at the far side of the road. His tactical light lit up the tree line as bright as day. Will didn't have a tactical light mounted on the Beowulf, so he pulled out his ProTac HL5X from his belt and lit up the area. Its 3,500 lumens lit up the tree line like a beacon, and behind him Blanchard was coming up quickly with a shotgun against his shoulder. "McKelvey!" shouted Will. They waited but didn't hear an answer. The woods around them were eerily silent. They could all feel eyes in the darkness watching their every move. "You hear that?" asked Doc. "Hear what?" asked Blanchard, sweeping around behind them with a shotgun. "Exactly," said Doc. "I don't hear a damn thing. It's dead quiet. Does that strike anyone as odd?" "Who the fuck are you anyway?" asked Blanchard, not taking his eyes off the tree line. "We'll make the intros later," said Will. "He's with me, Mike." "Well, good enough," said Blanchard. "McKelvey!" shouted Will, his voice echoing into the night. To their right, an old firebreak road ran off into the trees. It was mostly overgrown with weeds, but you could still see the path through the dense growth of Ozark's woodland. As he swept the firebreak with his light, Will caught a glimpse of reflected light in the darkness. "I've got something," said Will. "Cover me." Doc didn't miss a step, but moved parallel to Will as he advanced into the firebreak. Blanchard came along behind them, walking backwards as best as he could to cover their flank. Will focused his attention on the spot where he'd seen the reflected light and let the others cover his advance. He trusted both men with his life. Doc because they'd been through hell together in Afghanistan, and Mike because they'd been through a very different hell here in Lackland County. 50 yards into the firebreak, a second firebreak opened to their right and led deeper into the woods. Where the two firebreaks met, Will found what had gotten his attention. There was a section of grass that had been matted down. The ground was torn up and there was blood all over the area. Sitting on a rock, angled so that it would face back toward the road, was a bloodied Lackland County deputy's badge. There was still a chunk of shirt attached to the back of the badge. From the way it was sitting there, it was clear that it had been placed there intentionally. "Doc," said Will, "tell me a man can lose this much blood and live." Doc glanced over the area and made some quick mental calculations before speaking. "It's possible," said Doc, his voice growing soft. "It's unlikely, but it's possible. If the bleeding was stopped in time, they could be alive, assuming this is human blood. Do you think he might have taken one of those things out?" "I doubt it," answered Will. "From what I can see, there's only casings here from a pistol. McKelvey didn't bring his rifle or his shotgun with him." "Damn," hissed Blanchard. "I saw that thing shrug off your shotgun. Ain't no way a 9mm Glock took that damn thing out." "Found the gun," said Will. "Slide's locked back and the mag's been ejected. He didn't go down without a fight." "That's a good boy," said Blanchard. "I don't really like the little bastard, but he's still one of ours." "Should I grab the gun?" asked Doc. "Leave it," said Will. "Dead or alive, this is a crime scene now. We've got to preserve it as much as possible. Let's go to the right." "Why?" asked Blanchard. "Because that's the way the blood trail leads," said Will. "Deeper into the woods," muttered Blanchard. "This is fucking great." "I'm right behind you, Will," said Doc. "Never doubted it," said Will. "Guys," said Blanchard, a note of fear creeping into his voice, "I think maybe we should fall back to the vehicles and wait for backup." "Not until I find McKelvey," said Will. "McKelvey's dead," said Blanchard, his tone chillingly cold. "We don't know that," said Will, glancing toward Blanchard. "Well, I think we can safely assume that now," said Blanchard. "I've got a leg over here. Well, part of a leg anyway." Will turned and looked where Mike was shining his flashlight. In the weeds near the edge of the firebreak was a leg that had been torn off at the knee. It was still wearing a tactical boot. There was a Glock 26 in an ankle holster still attached to the leg. "That's McKelvey," said Blanchard. "I doubt anyone else out here in the middle of nowhere wears tactical boots." "That's a massive wound," said Doc, looking at the ragged flesh where the knee used to be. "The shock alone would be enough to kill most people. With the torn femoral, he would have bled out in seconds without a tourniquet in place." "Fall back to the cars," said Will after a moment's hesitation. "That might not be possible," said Blanchard. "Why's that?" asked Doc. "Because there are two of those damn things coming up the fire break from that direction," said Blanchard, pointing. Will started sweeping the area in every direction. There were at least two approaching from each direction in the fire breaks. They were surrounded. He knew they'd never outrun them in the woods. Their best chance was in fighting their way back to the cars. "Get ready," said Will, slipping the safety off the Beowulf. He could hear the safeties click off on the other weapons as well. "Ready," said Blanchard. "I'm ready," said Doc. "If torso shots don't do the trick," said Will, "then aim for the heads. That should at least get their attention." "Copy that," said Doc. "Hell yes," said Blanchard. "On three," said Will. 3, 2, 1. Beowulf bellowed like its namesake and shattered the stillness of the night. Will saw fur and blood fly from the head of one of the creatures that stood between them and the vehicles. He was already adjusting to the other target when he heard both Blanchard and Doc engaging targets of their own. The resounding boom of the shotgun nearly drowned out the muted cough of the suppressed AR. "Move!" roared Will, heading directly at the second creature in the firebreak ahead of him. The second thunderous report of the Beowulf rolled off into the night as Will watched fur and blood erupt from the left shoulder of the second creature, spinning it completely around and tossing it into the trees like a rag doll. "Run!" Will screamed, breaking into a sprint toward the vehicles. The road ahead was still bathed in the electric light of the LED emergency lights. Will pushed hard until he reached the edge of the light put out by the headlights of the vehicles. Then he spun around and brought the Beowulf up to his shoulder. Doc ran past him, changing magazines as he moved. Blanchard was a bit slower, never having been much of a runner, but adrenaline nearly made up for it. He was close behind Doc. Just as Blanchard was about to reach the relative safety of the light, one of the creatures emerged from the darkness. It was as black as the night itself and drove into Blanchard's side with the force of an NFL linebacker at full sprint. The shotgun went flying off into the darkness as Blanchard was borne to the ground under the crushing weight of the savage dogman. Blood erupted into the air as the creature slashed violently into the side of Blanchard's rib cage. Will could see muscle and bone appear briefly before the blood filled the 4 long gouges that had been torn into his side. Mike screamed in pain as the beast prepared to take another piece from him. From the way the creature held its hand back and poised to strike, Will could see that this one was intended for the throat. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Will's brain processed the scene before him. Blanchard was screaming silently into the night. The creature was looking into his eyes with a feral malevolence that showed far more intelligence than any mere animal. Will could see that the creature's hands resembled a raccoon's hands more than they did a human. The claws on the tips of the fingers glistened in the light, coated with Mike's blood. Before the beast could finish Blanchard off, Will fired into the side of its head at a range of less than 10 feet. Gore flew into the darkness as the creature's head seemed to erupt. It was propelled to the side and knocked clear of Blanchard. The other creatures were coming, but still more than 30 yards away. Will ran forward and grabbed Blanchard by the armpits, letting the Beowulf drop to hang around his neck by a single-point strap. Pushing with all his strength in his legs, he began dragging Blanchard into the light, and behind him, soft reports of the suppressed AR continued to spit out high-velocity projectiles that seemed to do little to slow the advance of the 6 dogmen. Releasing his grip on Blanchard, Will's right hand came away covered in blood. "Doc!" screamed Will. "Man down!" "Cover me!" roared Doc, dropping his AR to hang from the single-point strap. Will stood up and was reaching for the Beowulf when the reports from the numerous large-caliber rifles split the night. Will could see multiple hits on the dogmen, and the creatures instantly vanished into the darkness of the woods. He turned to see who had opened fire, and they saw 6 First Nations warriors emerging from the darkness near the road. They were all wearing buckskins and were covered in white ceremonial paint. Will recognized the war paint from the stories his grandfather had told him. Other than the rifles, which were all modern heavy-caliber AR-style weapons, they all could have just stepped out of the pages of a history book. He was looking at Lakota dog soldiers. "Funny seeing you here, Grey Eagle," said Mika Kanowektakte. "Do you have any idea of the shit you just walked into?" Chapter 10. Officer Down. When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier. Rudyard Kipling. "Will!" shouted Doc. "Get over here. We got to stop this bleeding." Will turned and ran over to where Doc was crouched over Mike Blanchard. Mike's face was beaded with sweat from pain and pale from blood loss. "What do you need?" asked Will. "Get one of the big kits out of the car," said Doc, stripping off Mike's body armor and then yanking his shirt off. Wadding up the shirt, he applied pressure to the 4 long gashes that ran down Mike's chest, from collarbone to just below the rib cage on the right side. Will returned with one of the large vehicle kits, tearing the plastic wrapper off as he ran. Sliding on his knees in the frozen grass for the last few feet, he tore the kit open and started yanking out the contents. "Looks like it didn't breach the pleural space," said Doc, thinking out loud. "At least that's a plus. If it had dropped the lung, we'd have a much bigger problem." "What do you need?" asked Will, tearing the packets open. "Get me all the quick clot gauze you can grab," said Doc. "Fluff it out for me. I need to pack it into these wounds. Keep it coming until I say stop." "Got it," said Will. They were both surprised when Mika joined them and started tearing gauze out of the packets and handing it to him. Will started fluffing out the gauze and handing it to Doc. After stuffing all the wounds full of gauze, Doc applied pressure. "Give this a minute to do its job," said Doc. "I'm going to need some Izzies." "Got it," said Will. "What the fuck is an Izzy?" asked Mika. "Israeli bandages," said Will. "Those packets right there." Mika began tearing them open and handing them to Will, who laid them out across Blanchard's chest in preparation for the next part. After a few minutes, Doc began rolling the Israeli bandages completely around Mike's chest and directly over the wounds, centering the tensioner clip right on top. It took 5 bandages to completely cover the wound. "That should hold for now," said Doc, "but we need to get him to the hospital right away." "It'll take a half an hour to get an ambulance out here," said Will. "Let's get him into the back of one of the cars," said Mika. "You guys are going to have to get him out of here." "What about you?" asked Will. "We're hunting those things," said Mika. "We're not going anywhere." They loaded Blanchard into the back of his own car. Will grabbed the keys from Mike's belt hook and tossed them to Doc. "Get him to town," said Will. "The hospital is right by the interstate at the Mill Creek exit." "I'll find it," said Doc. "What about you?" "I'm staying here," said Will. "I'm going with Mika. We're going to find those things." "You weren't kidding," said Doc. "What the hell are they?" "I'm not completely sure," said Will. "The only thing I know for certain is they have to be stopped." "Okay, but I'm coming back out here as soon as he's taken care of," said Doc. "You aren't going after them without me. Where can I find you?" "We have a campsite set up at Mountain Creek," said Mika. Just go into the Prosperine campground and look for the motorcycles. Got it, said Doc, jumping into the front seat of the Charger. Can I run lights and sirens? Absolutely, said Will. Just get him there in one piece. With that, Doc turned the car around and headed back down the road, accelerating as he went out of sight. Will returned to his own Charger and radioed it in. 636 to dispatch, he said. Go ahead, 636, said dispatch. I have a civilian driving 625's unit heading to the hospital in Lebanon, explained Will. 625 is wounded and requires immediate medical attention. Copy that, 636, said dispatch. Have you located 613? Not at this time, said Will. What's the ETA on additional units? Car 1 is 7 minutes out, said dispatch. 618 is approximately 4 minutes behind car 1. Understood, said Will. 636 out. Turning around, he found 6 warriors waiting for him. Mika was standing in the front and seemed to be the one in charge of the group. They're gone, said Mika. We can't track them in the dark. What about their dead? Asked Will. They always carry off their dead, said another warrior. You'll be lucky to find blood. So what's next? Asked Will. We disappear, said Mika. I don't think your sheriff is going to be very thrilled when he sees us. You're probably right about that, agreed Will. Once you've finished here, said Mika, come see us at our campsite. We'll explain more then. All right, said Will. The warriors faded back into the darkness. Will could hear the distant approaching siren of the responding units. He quickly reloaded the Beowulf and double-checked the area. He didn't have that feeling of being watched anymore, but there was no sense in letting his guard down. After a few minutes, an approaching Charger began slowing down and came to a stop right behind Will's car. The sheriff himself exited the vehicle and started toward him, his pistol in his hands and at low ready. What's going on, Will? He asked. It's not good, sir, said Will. I gathered that, said the sheriff impatiently. Tell me what's going on. Blanchard is on his way to the hospital, said Will. I'm fairly certain that McKelvey is dead. Fairly? Asked the sheriff. Did you find his body? We found part of it, said Will darkly. His leg was torn off at the knee. Torn off? Said Sheriff Miller. How? By the same creatures that attacked the victims at both crime scenes, explained Will. Creatures? Said Miller, frowning. What kind of creatures? I thought that was an animal attack. Well, that's what we originally thought, Sheriff, said Will, pausing for a moment before looking the sheriff directly in the eyes, until we saw them for ourselves. I can't say what exactly they are, but I know that they aren't anything I've ever seen before. My people call them the Longa Doglala. They're not animal or human. You know how this sounds, don't you? Asked Miller. It sounds goddamn crazy. Did you have any proof of any of this? Well, I have several eyewitnesses, replied Will. What about McKelvey's dash cam? Asked Miller. If McKelvey saw something, then it should have been captured on the camera. Well, I haven't checked it yet, sir, Will answered, glancing toward the car. Miller sat down in the driver's seat of McKelvey's patrol car and popped the memory card out of the dash cam. He slipped the card into the reader on the MDT and began bringing up the last recording. As the video began to play, they could hear McKelvey calling into dispatch. On the screen, there was only the headlights illuminating an empty section of gravel road with dark, foreboding trees along both sides. 613 to dispatch, said McKelvey. Go ahead, 613, replied dispatch. Show me out at Kinfolk Road near Prosperine River Access, said McKelvey. I'm checking a suspicious person. Copy that, 613, said dispatch. Kinfolk Road near Prosperine. Do you have a description of the subject? I just caught a glimpse, answered McKelvey. They were big and wearing dark clothing. I thought it was a gigantic wolf until they stood up. Say again, 613, said dispatch. Did you say you thought the person was a wolf? Affirmative, said McKelvey. There's something weird going on. I'm going to make contact and find out what they're doing out here in the middle of nowhere. Copy, 613, said Dispatch. Do you need another unit? Not at this time, answered McKelvey. I'll advise. They could hear McKelvey exiting the vehicle. Moments later, McKelvey emerged on the video, striding out into the road in front of the cruiser. His flashlight was in his left hand, illuminating the left side of the road at the tree line. And in his right hand was his department-issued Glock 19 in the high-ready position. Since he was wearing a body mic, they could clearly hear his voice. Step out and show me your hands, McKelvey commanded. At first, there was nothing. No movement, no apparent response to his commands. And then they could see that McKelvey began looking around nervously in several directions. Tucking his flashlight under his arm, he keyed up his radio. 613 to dispatch, he said. There was a note of fear in his voice. Start another unit this direction, code 3. Miller and Will exchanged glances. Code 3 meant he needed immediate backup and that there was a serious threat. There was no response from dispatch, and Miller frowned. That's not good, said Miller. Why didn't they respond? McKelvey began moving closer to the vehicle, moving the weapon back and forth to cover what could only be multiple targets that were not in the view of the dash cam. Before he left the video frame, he stopped and faced the back of the vehicle, freezing in his tracks. It was apparent that something was now blocking him from getting back to the car. What the fuck? Said McKelvey, backing up slowly as his eyes grew wide in fear. Behind him, a dark figure emerged from the trees. At first, it was blurry and out of focus, but the high-resolution camera quickly focused. What the hell is that thing? Sheriff Miller exclaimed. That's what we saw, answered Will. That's what killed the victims at the park over in Cameron County. As they watched, the creature took several steps on two legs and let out a howling snarl that made both men's blood turn to ice water. On the screen, McKelvey turned that direction and opened fire. The creature dropped to all fours and began bounding toward him with frightening speed. McKelvey turned and ran for the trees, firing as he ran. Dispatch! Screamed McKelvey. I need backup now! In seconds, both McKelvey and the creature had disappeared from the video. More gunshots could be heard, followed by a grunt of pain. McKelvey's body mic picked up the moment the creature caught him. There was a whoosh of air rushing out of him, and then a blood-curdling snarl. There was one more gunshot, and then a tearing sound began as McKelvey began to scream. He screamed for several seconds before it turned to a gurgling sound, which abruptly ended with a sharp crack. Son of a bitch, whispered Miller. 3 more of the creatures emerged in the dashcam footage. They differed in color from the first. While the first one was black as the dead of night, the 2 others were gray and white, with one that was almost completely brown. They vanished off the screen, and soon you could hear the snarls of the creatures as they began tearing McKelvey apart. Fortunately, that was when the body mic cut out. Once again, there were only the headlights illuminating an empty section of gravel road with dark and foreboding trees along both sides. Even more foreboding now with the knowledge of what was out there. 613, said dispatch. Did you have traffic? There was a long pause before dispatch spoke again. 613, do you copy? Another pause. 613, do you read? Over, said the young woman at dispatch, a note of panic in her tone. Silence was her only reply. 613. Still no response. Dispatch to all units, said the young woman, real fear in her voice. 613 is not responding. Request all additional units respond to Kinfolk Road near Prosperine River access. With that, the dashcam feed went dead. Why the hell did it take dispatch so long to respond? Demanded the sheriff. Well, does it matter? Asked Will. No one could have responded in time to save him. We couldn't have gotten here in time, even in a helicopter. Secure the scene, said Sheriff Miller. We're doing this by the numbers. Yes, sir, replied Will. One more thing, said the sheriff. No word of this video to anyone, replied the sheriff. We keep this to ourselves until I can figure out what our next move is. Understood, sir, replied Will. Chapter 11. Dog Soldiers. People seeking a myth will usually find one. Pueblo proverb. It was nearly midday before they completed the investigation at the scene. They had only managed to recover McKelvey's right leg and left hand. In addition, they had located his duty pistol, badge, and flashlight. The slide on the pistol had been locked back with an empty magazine a few feet away. Although there had been a large amount of blood at the initial point of attack, the trail quickly vanished and no further sign could be found. With another cold front moving in and several additional inches of snow forecasted to begin falling within the hour, the sheriff reluctantly called off the search. It was clear from the carnage that they were now only looking to recover the body. They had little or no hope that McKelvey was alive. Doc had returned sometime after 10 that morning and stood by patiently waiting for Will to finish processing the scene. He'd let them know that Blanchard was in stable condition and would likely be in the hospital for a while. The sheriff left with the county coroner, who had taken custody of the few remains that had been recovered. One by one, the remaining deputies and detectives left the area, heading back into town to file their reports. Will joined Doc and climbed into the big Charger. Firing up the engine, he let it idle so that they could turn on the heat. They sat in silence for a long moment while Will blew breaths into his cupped hands, trying to warm them back up. "You okay?" asked Doc after a long pause. "Yeah," said Will, "I will be." "What's next?" asked Doc, slipping off his gloves and pouring 2 cups of coffee from a thermos. "Where did you get that coffee?" asked Will. "One of the detectives brought out several thermoses," explained Doc. "I snagged one for us." "Thanks," Will said, gratefully accepting a steaming cup of the dark liquid. Taking a deep breath of the hot coffee, he closed his eyes and let the aroma wash over him. Taking a long sip, he let the warmth spread into him, savoring the feeling after the cold had seeped into his bones. "Smells like crappy army coffee," said Doc. "I've been spoiled since I got out. I'm used to the expensive coffee from a coffee shop." "It'll do the trick," said Will. "It might taste terrible, but it'll keep you awake, and it's warm." "Well, fair enough," said Doc, taking a sip of his own coffee. "I already told the sheriff that I won't be filing my report for a while," said Will. "I told him we were going to try to find where these things live." "Well, what did he say to that?" asked Doc. "He wasn't happy," replied Will, "but he understood. He doesn't want to let anyone know what we're really up against." "Why?" said Doc. "People deserve to know what's out there." "I agree," said Will, "but would anyone really believe it?" Probably not," answered Doc, shaking his head. "They'd think we're nuts." "Exactly," said Will, reaching down and turning the heater to full. Warm air began flowing from the vents and slowly began forcing the coal from the car. Both men sipped their coffee for a few moments before continuing, each briefly lost in their own thoughts. "So now what?" asked Doc, turning to face Will. "We head for Mika's camp," said Will. "We're going to find out what they know and try to take the fight to the Olonga Doglala." "What is that?" asked Doc. "That's the Cherokee word for those creatures," explained Will. "I never believed in most of those old legends, but now I'm starting to rethink a lot of the stories I was told as a boy." "Is there an easier way to say it? Is there an English word for that?" asked Doc, smiling. "Dogman," replied Will. "I was going to say werewolf," said Doc. "Well, it's similar, only that these things don't change shape. They're always in this form." "Well, that might be the scariest shit I've heard in a long time," said Doc. "Please tell me that they're only a local thing." Well, actually, Will replied, there are similar tales in almost every First Nations tribe. They've been seen almost everywhere. Well, that certainly makes camping trips more interesting, said Doc. And it sheds new light on a lot of disappearances in the woods, added Will. Next, you're going to tell me that Bigfoot really exists, said Doc, staring into his coffee. Well, there's lore on them in every tribe as well, said Will. If Dogman exists, then I'm fairly certain that Bigfoot does too. Well, that's the last time I go camping without arming for bear, said Doc, shaking his head in disbelief. Think the national parks would understand why I'm packing in a Vulcan turret? Let's go meet up with Mika and see what we can learn, said Will, slipping the car into gear. It was only a few minutes down the road to the Prosperine River access turnoff. Will slowed down and followed the driveway to the left. It didn't take long before they followed another road to the left that led closer to the Niangua River. Set back in the trees were 3 camper trailers with 3 large extended cab dually pickups attached to them. Parked nearby were nearly a dozen motorcycles. Well, said Doc, didn't he say look for the motorcycles? Yeah, agreed Will, I think that's the place. Pulling into the campsite, he put the Charger in park and shut off the engine. And just as they were getting out of the car, Mika emerged from the nearest trailer. Gone was the war paint and buckskins, replaced by the more familiar black t-shirt, blue jeans, and black leather jacket. As he turned to shut the door to the trailer, Will saw the circular back patch on the jacket once again. Ghost Dance MC, said Doc. Well, I've never heard of it before. Well, neither had I before a couple of days ago, said Will. I'm not up on motorcycle clubs. Welcome to the Ghost Dance MC Chapter House, said Mika. It's the Missouri edition. What's this about? Asked Will, gesturing at the assembled vehicles and campers. Let's get inside, said Mika. I want to introduce you to everyone before I explain. Who is the Washiku? My name's Carrie, said Doc, extending his hand. Mika didn't take it, but instead just looked expectantly at Will. He's an old friend of mine, said Will. We served in the army together. He's good. He's saved my life a couple of times. I saw the medical skills for myself, said Mika. Might be a handy dude to have around. Well, I try, said Doc, flashing a sardonic smile. Okay, said Mika after a moment. He can stay. Normally this is a Reds kids only club. Do I get to know the secret handshake and everything? Asked Doc, chuckling. Smart ass, said Will, shaking his head. I like him, said Mika. He's funny. If it helps, added Doc, I'm part Cherokee on my mom's side and part Creek on my dad's side. Well then, said Mika, we'll teach you the secret handshake after all. Follow me. Mika led the way back into the trailer. As they entered, they were immediately hit with the humid fragrance of sage and other herbs being burned. To Will, it was an all too familiar scent. It reminded him of his grandfather's house and of the tribal council hall on the reservation. Inside were several men and women dressed the same as Mika, black leather jackets and jeans. They were all watching the newcomers with unfriendly gazes. Let me introduce everyone, said Mika. As Mika called out their names, they each nodded briefly but said nothing. Jacob Minga and David Apisi, both Blackfeet from the res in Montana, said Mika. Next is Samuel Tehelapakmi and Kaylee Wanoka, both Northern Cheyenne from the res in Montana. And then we have Joseph Wapasha and Katie Wakiwi and Sarah Makiwi. They're all in from your neck of the woods, Gray Eagle. They're from the Pine Ridge res. The other 3 are all Cherokee from the nation in Oklahoma. There's Melissa Tsinganista, Alyssa Amandahe, and Ben Okananaka. The 2 standing by the back door are Chiricahua Apache from New Mexico, and that's Maria Ditesti and her brother Thomas Linlotek. I'm Will Gray Eagle, said Will. My mother was Oglala Lakota, and my father was an Anawe Cherokee. I came here and was raised by my maternal grandfather after my parents died in a car crash. Who is your grandfather? Asked Melissa. J. Matoshek, said Will. A look of surprise mixed with something else passed through the group of warriors. Will recognized the significance of the exchange, but had no idea what it could mean. Holy shit, said Ben. He's a freaking legend. He's a powerful medicine man. Mika didn't tell us you were White Bear's grandson. Mika was looking at Will with a newfound respect. That's because I didn't know, answered Mika. I think it's no accident that our paths have crossed. Well, this is Carrie Davis, said Will, gesturing at Doc. You can call him Doc. Most people do. My maternal grandmother was Cherokee, said Doc, and my great-grandmother on my father's side was Creek. I don't really know much about them, though. Why is he here? Asked Sarah. He's with me, said Will. If he is with the grandson of J. Matoshek, said Ben, then it's good enough for me. Do any of you really want him pissed at you? No one said anything, but they did exchange a few dark glances. Look, said Mika, it's not that we don't trust your friend, but this has to do with our people. These creatures are an ancient enemy, and it's up to us to stop them. Well, what's the motorcycle club for then? Asked Will. I know your name came up in a drug investigation. And I was cleared, answered Mika. We call ourselves the Ghost Dance MC because no one would believe what we truly are. Well then, what are you? Asked Will, frowning. We're Hatamataneo, answered Samuel. We're dog soldiers. I thought they were all gone, said Will. Yeah, said Doc. I thought the cavalry wiped them out more than a century ago. Well, that's what we wanted them to believe, answered Kaylee. There weren't many left, but they taught others and kept the tradition alive. The Hatamataneo were around long before the white men came to our lands, said Samuel. Their true purpose was to protect our people from these creatures that you call dogmen. We formed the Ghost Dance MC to keep people from getting too nosy, said Mika. No one asks too many questions to a bunch of bikers. No one but cops, replied Will. There is that, agreed Mika, but we don't deal drugs. We do business with people that exist outside your laws and that occasionally bring us into contact with law enforcement. And that's how we met. And I was brought in for questioning because I bought some guns from a dude your detectives are watching. Okay, so what's next? Asked Doc. Where do we go from here? We're going to find the Alanga Daglala, said Mika, and stop them before they kill more people. Why you? Asked Will. Why help people who aren't First Nations? Because if we don't stop them, said Maria, no one else will. You can't stop them with just guns. It seemed like we put a few of them down last night, said Doc. I saw at least one drop with a headshot. That won't kill them, explained Mika. It'll only slow them down for a while. Well, then how do we kill them? Asked Will. With silver bullets that have been treated with white ash, said Mika, and then blessed by a powerful medicine man. The problem is we're running low on bullets. There aren't many medicine men strong enough to make them anymore. That generation is dying off a little at a time. J. Matoshek could do it, said Alyssa. We've got plenty of silver and white ash. I'm sure that grandfather would be willing to help, said Will. The creatures have been to his house and he wasn't very happy about that. Then we need to get him here before the sun goes down, said Mika. We need to be ready. Do they only come out at night? Asked Doc. No, but they're definitely more active then, replied Alyssa. Far bolder when they have the advantage. They know we can't see them in the dark. Well, how can you be so sure? Asked Doc. I mean, how smart can they be? Oh, they're very smart, answered Mika. They can communicate with each other and plan raids and attacks. They can set traps and move through the woods without leaving a trail. They're also the best trackers I've ever seen. They can follow prey for miles, even if we're in a vehicle. Damn, said Doc. I was afraid you were going to say something like that. Then our only choice is to take the fight to them. Anything else would be suicide. We've tracked them this far, said Mika. We know that they have a den somewhere within 10 miles of here. The closer they get to their lair, the more they try to conceal their tracks. Well, how often do you see 'em in the daylight? Asked Will. Well, it's not often, replied Alyssa. They stay close to their lair during the day. Then they have to be close to my grandfather's house, said Will. They were out in the daylight when we were there. The attack on the family in Cameron County isn't far from there either. It's less than 10 miles, I would estimate. Then that's a good place to start, said Mika. Would your grandfather object to us bringing the campers to his place? Yeah, could you call him and ask? Added Maria. He doesn't have a phone, replied Will. He refuses to use much technology at all. Under the circumstances, I seriously doubt he'll object. Then we break camp, said Mika. I want to be moving within the hour. The group split up and began taking down the gear that was set up and loading it into the trailers and beds of the pickups. Will and Doc helped Mika put the bikes onto a trailer. It took the group less than 30 minutes to have everything loaded and ready to go. Around the camp, engines began to rumble to life as they began letting them warm up for the trip. Lead the way, said Mika, nodding at Will. I know a way that keeps us off the main highways, explained Will. We should be there in less than 30 minutes. Good, said Mika, glancing at the position of the sun in the sky. We don't have a lot of daylight left, and we've got a lot to get done before it gets dark. Mika climbed into the passenger side of the blue Ford F-350 dually extended cab. Will backed out of the campsite and turned back into the road and headed back the way he'd entered the campground. The makeshift convoy fell into formation behind him. Will kept the pace slow to accommodate the much larger vehicles pulling the campers. 10 minutes later, the gravel road led them to the pavement again, coming out almost at the edge of the little town of Eldridge. Doc nervously rechecked the magazines on all the weapons and continually watched the sides of the road. Maintaining a speed that easily matched the trucks, Will kept his eye on the road ahead. He kept expecting to see trees falling into his path, but none appeared. As they once again left the pavement, he began to get the uneasy feeling that they were being watched. Doc noticed it as well, and he worked the bolt on his AR and slipped a single-point sling around his neck. They're watching us, aren't they? Asked Doc. Yep, said Will. You feel it too? Pretty much, said Doc. I learned to trust those weird feelings back in Afghanistan. Stay alert, said Will. Stay alive, finished Doc. As they turned left, leaving the gravel road and shifting onto the seldom-used driveway that led to his grandfather's house, they could see the tree that had been shoved across the road was still there. Slowing to a stop, he put the Charger in park and prepared to get out. We've got to move that tree, said Will, reaching for the door handle. In the mirror, Will saw most of the others exiting their vehicles and readying their weapons. Without a word, they fanned out and began covering the tree line. Will and Doc moved toward the tree, sweeping their weapons from side to side to make certain that there wasn't one of the creatures hiding on the other side. Let's get moving, said Mika, heading back to his truck. No arguments here, said Will, heading back to the Charger at a quick pace. In the trees, they could catch occasional glimpses of movement, but nothing approached. Will doubted that there were more than a few of the creatures. They were likely there just to observe. If there had been a larger number, it was far more likely that they would have attacked the moment they exited the vehicles. Putting the big Charger back into gear, he accelerated slowly so as not to create too much distance between the vehicles. Doc rolled down his window and began covering the side of the road with his weapon, and behind them, Will could see others doing the same on both sides of the road. As they rounded the last bend in the road, Will fully expected to see his grandfather and his cousin waiting for them with weapons at the ready. But instead, he was shocked to find that the parking area had been cleared of obstructions and a crude circular structure had been built. A large fire was burning near the structure, and Will could see his cousin Jason tending the fire. There was no sign of his grandfather. In the field, near the bend in the driveway, there were more than a dozen vehicles parked in the grass. Some were older pickup trucks, and a few were SUVs. but several were smaller economy cars. Will caught sight of the license plates from Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. Whoever they were, some of them had traveled some distance to be here. Some had undoubtedly come from one of the reservations near Miami, Oklahoma. The trucks fanned out and pulled into a rough circle, stopping well short of the structure. Now that they had gotten closer, Will could see that it was crudely made of logs and covered with hides, with a pile of large stones near the fire pit. Jason was using a large branch to move stones around the edge of the fire. "What the heck is that?" asked Doc. "It's a sweat lodge," said Will. "Apparently my grandfather is planning on having a sweat." "Do we really have time for a sauna?" asked Doc. "My people call it the Inipi," explained Will. "In Lakota, it means to live again. It is a spiritual cleansing, symbolizing rebirth, and Grandfather is summoning the old magic to fight these creatures." "Do you really believe we're going to stop them with magic?" asked Doc. "A few days ago," said Will, "I might have said no, but we've both seen what the Olonga Daglala are capable of. Now I know that it's going to take more than just guns to stop them." "Well, that much is certain," said Doc. "If this helps, then let's do it." As they all began approaching the sweat lodge, Will could see the solemn looks on the faces of the Hatamataneo. Mika approached Will and nodded grimly. "Has this always been here?" he asked. "No," replied Will. "It wasn't here yesterday. My grandfather must have built it today." From the back door of the house, Will saw his grandfather emerge leading a group of others. They were all dressed in ceremonial buckskins and headdresses. He recognized some of the faces, but many of them he did not, and from their demeanor and bearing he knew that they had to all be elders in their respective tribes. From the beads and headdresses he recognized representatives from the Cherokee, the Osage, and the Ojibwe, and the Arapaho. Will waited in respectful silence until they had all arrived and took their positions around the sweat lodge. And as if on cue, they all began chanting in unison, and then began dancing in a large circle around the lodge. Jason continued to stoke the fire and roll rocks in and out of the coals. A few of the elders leaned down as they danced and picked up round skin drums, beating in perfect rhythm to the dance. "What are they doing?" whispered Doc. Surprisingly, it was Mika who answered. "What you're seeing, few white men have ever witnessed. This is a sacred dance that I never thought I would see in my own lifetime." "It's called the Great Ghost Dance," added Will. "It dates to the late 1800s, although some of my people say it was far older than that. They are calling on the spirits of our ancestors to help us defeat this enemy," said Mika, his eyes reflecting in the flickering firelight. Slowly the tempo of the dance increased along with the drumming, and with a glance at each other, the Hatamataneo began taking off their clothing. They stripped down completely to the waist and then removed the boots and pants, leaving only their undergarments. One by one they began slipping through the circles, passing between the dancers and then ducking low and entering the sweat lodge. Will nodded at Doc and said, "You don't have to join us if you don't want to." Will began removing his gear. The cold air felt refreshing on his bare skin. Once he'd removed his clothing, he followed along behind the others. "Well," said Doc, glancing around, "what the hell? When in Rome?" Quickly, he slipped out of his body armor and clothes. "Damn it," he hissed, "it's freezing out here." Sliding into the line behind Will, he waited his turn to slip between the dancers, and as fate would have it, he passed directly in front of Jay Matoshak. There was a moment when their eyes connected, and Doc felt a strange sensation wash over him. There was real power in the older man's eyes. Doc felt it dance along his skin like electricity surging through him. In that moment, he felt something awaken in him, like a genetic memory of times long ago. He knew in that instant that there was a blood connection to this ritual. Just as fast as it appeared, it was gone, leaving behind the feeling of peace and understanding. Ducking low, he followed Will into the sweat lodge and took his place beside the pile of heated rocks. Mika was already dousing them with water, and the steam was growing thick. The feeling of cold was replaced with the humid heat that seeped in through their pores and instantly covered them with glistening sweat. Outside, they could still hear the chanting and the drums of the elders as they danced the sacred ghost dance. It was growing faint, as if something from a long distance away. More water was poured onto the stones, and the air became thick with humidity. Will felt his vision begin to swim, and then an icy blast of air filled the room as the flap over the door opened once more to allow Grandfather to enter. He was still chanting to the rhythm of the ghost dance. Jason took the opportunity to replace several of the heated rocks and then dropped the flap back into place. Taking his place facing the door, Grandfather reached into the water basin and took out a wooden bowl. He filled the bowl with liquid and he pressed it to his lips and took a drink before passing it to the next person. Each person, in turn, took a drink and then passed it on. And when it reached Will, he sniffed the liquid before taking a sip. It wasn't just water in the bowl. Doc took a drink and then grimaced at the unexpected foul taste. Once the bowl was returned to Grandfather, he drank again and then placed it back into the basin. And during the entire exchange, he never stopped chanting. Mika was the first to take up the chant and join him. Will followed next, and the others joined in. Even Doc was moved to join in to the hypnotic rhythm of the chant. He felt strangely detached, as if he was watching this from afar. His vision was swimming, and it appeared as if there were colors now beginning to swirl in the stream that filled the air. "My children," said Grandfather, "I will be your guide on the spiritual journey that we are about to begin." Doc held up his hands in front of his face and studied his fingers for a moment. Through the fog that was now filling his brain, two things occurred to him. One, there had to have been peyote in the water that he drank. That certainly explained the colors that were growing bolder and moving through the steamy air. They were beginning to take vague shapes, and their movements were becoming easier to track. The second was that Grandfather was not speaking English. It had to be Lakota that he was speaking, but his mind didn't comprehend how he could understand it. "I am White Bear," said Grandfather, "son of Walks with Wind. Let the voices of our ancestors be heard to bring us the wisdom we seek to defeat this ancient foe. Show us the visions that will guide us through the darkness, and show us the sacred pathways of our past, present, and future." Jay began singing softly at first, but with growing strength and power. As he chanted, images began to swirl in Doc's mind, dancing in the thick fog that filled the sweat lodge. The visions began to coalesce and turn into vivid tableaus that danced before them in the ever-swirling mist. For each of them, it was a deeply personal journey that brought them truths about themselves and their own destinies. For Doc, it was far different than it was for the others. Visions of slaughter filled his mind. Massacres of entire villages, blood and death, warriors fighting valiantly, but futilely, against an enemy that they could not hope to defeat. Sometimes the enemy was in the form of the Olonga Daglala, and other times they had the faces of men. Each time a threat arose, he saw himself in war paint and buckskins of the Hatamataneo, standing to face the enemy. Each time he would begin the dance of death with the enemy, and each time he fell to the unbeatable foe. And even in death he smiled in the knowledge that he did not fall alone. Scores of the enemy lay battered and broken around him, marking the spot where he fell, their blood flowing together in rivers of carnage and death. In his visions, he saw warriors fighting from horseback with tomahawk and lance. He saw warriors on foot with both knife and rifle. There were the Olonga as well as the other creatures that he had never believed existed. Humongous, hairy beasts that looked to be equal parts man and ape. He didn't know the native name for them, but in his mind they were called Bigfoot. The tribesmen battled against these creatures as well as the Olonga. They also battled with each other with primal rage like nothing he had ever seen before. He knew then that the Olonga feared these other creatures more than they feared men, that they were the mortal enemies that had been fighting and hunting each other since long before white men came to this continent. As the visions swirled once more, he saw dead men walking through the mist. Torn and bloodied, there was no life in their eyes. There were other things behind them in the mist, things that were not human, that appeared like giants. And when the mist parted, he was looking into Grandfather's eyes. In that instant, he knew that White Bear was a nexus, joining this critical moment in time with many others. He existed as a guide to direct the destinies of men crucial to the fate of mankind. There was fire and ice, blood and pain surging through a world of death and despair. And through it all, a man with white hair, numerous scars, and only one eye stood like a rock against the storm. He screamed a challenge into the raging storm, holding aloft a pair of matching swords. And then the mist grew thick and the colors faded until only the darkness remained. He felt heat, and then cold, and a sensation of falling, and then nothing. He slept a dreamless sleep, not fully knowing if he was even still alive or lost in the darkness of death. The rational part of his brain screamed for him to wake up. His subconscious heard the voices of his ancestors, welcoming him home again. Chapter 12. Killer Frost. Not all men seek rest and peace. Some are born with the spirit of the storm in their blood, restless harbingers of violence and bloodshed, knowing no other path. Robert E. Howard. When Doc opened his eyes, Will was leaning over him with a slight smile on his face. "Doc," said Will, "are you okay?" "I feel like I've been drinking all night," said Doc, wincing as the light hurt his eyes. "Or worse, hit by a truck." "That's the peyote," explained Will. "The real question is, did you have a vision?" "I did," replied Doc, "but my memory's hazy. I'm only remembering bits and pieces." "Well, that's not unusual either," said Will, handing Doc a cup of coffee. "Drink this, it'll help." Doc accepted the cup gratefully and sat up. Taking a long sniff of the hot liquid, he frowned and looked quizzically at Will. "Smells funny," said Doc. "Please tell me there isn't more peyote in this." "No peyote, I promise," explained Will. "Just my grandfather's secret coffee recipe. It's good, trust me. Now drink up. We need you up and around." "Why, what's going on?" asked Doc, sliding his legs off the bed he was laying in. "How long have I been out?" "Only a couple of hours," said Mika, leaning into the small bedroom from the hall. "Was that your first sweat?" "Yeah," said Doc, taking a sip of the coffee. "Hey, this is really good." "Thank you," said Grandfather from the other room. "Well, you did good for a white guy," said Mika. "I can tell you've got some tribal blood in you. Most guys freak out and they puke everywhere. You did good. Did I just hear you say you had a vision?" "Yeah," said Doc, "but I can't remember it all. It's fuzzy." "It'll come to you," said Mika. "Don't force it. Sometimes our minds take time to process what we saw in a vision." "Well, thanks," said Doc. "I'm just glad I didn't make a fool of myself." "It's going to be dark soon," said Will. "Finish your coffee and get dressed. We'll be in the living room when you're done. We need to get our plans in place before nightfall." "How long do we have?" asked Doc as Will headed out the door. "Less than an hour," he said, disappearing down the hall. Doc drank the coffee in 2 long pulls and then started getting dressed. All his clothing and gear had been placed in the room for him. Once his boots were on, he began velcroing his vest back into place. He grabbed his pack and headed down the hall toward the sounds of the voices. Emerging into the large room with a pool table, he could see through the large windows that he was on the lower level of the house. The windows looked out over the Niangua River Valley, and Doc could see why they had chosen to build the house on this spot. The view was beautiful. Will was seated next to his grandfather and cousin, while Mika and the Hatamataneo had taken seats along the northernmost wall next to the pool table. Doc grabbed a bar stool from beside the tall table and slid it close to where Will was sitting before taking his seat. "I think we're all aware of the situation," began Grandfather. "Although I didn't want to see it happen in my own lifetime, the Olanga Daglala have returned. Although I now suspect that they never really left." A few heads nodded among the Hatamataneo. Mika frowned as he nodded, indicating that this was indeed not his first time dealing with them. "While you were resting after the sweat," added Grandfather, "I gathered the elders and we prepared your weapons. You should have plenty of ammo for your guns, and we've also blessed many blades and axes." Gesturing at the pool table, they could see that it was covered with knives, tomahawks, and boxes of ammunition. There were even a few spears that had been crafted in the old way with flint tips and leather bindings. "Tonight they will come for us," explained Grandfather. "They have our scent and they know my magic. While the house will offer us certain protections, it will not withstand a direct assault. We must fight them when they come. More so, we must track them back to their lair and deal a fatal blow to this ancient enemy. The stronger they grow, the more difficult it will be to stop them." "We've got a plan in place to trap them here," said Jason, smiling. "If we can trap them and force them to fight, we can end this here tonight." "What if that doesn't work?" asked Doc. "Then we should break into teams," replied Mika. "One group will engage them directly, while other smaller groups will wait to track them back to their den. As dangerous as it'll be to fight them, it'll be worse for the trackers. If they spot you, then you'll be on your own and far from reinforcements." "Hoka hey," said Joseph. "2 teams of 3 will be the trackers," explained Mika. "I'll lead one with Joseph and Kaylee. We're all trackers, and Kaylee was a medic in the army. Gray Eagle will lead the other team with his friend Doc and Sarah. Gray Eagle and Sarah are both trackers, and Doc is just damned handy to have. I've seen him save a man that I didn't think could be saved." "Thanks," said Doc sheepishly. "Tracker teams will have to travel light," added Mika. "These things move fast. You're going to be hard-pressed to keep up with them. If you get surrounded, then hold for as long as you can. The others will be following, but will be carrying heavier weapons. I fully expect the trackers to outdistance everyone. If you hear gunshots, try to get to them as quickly as possible." "Who's leading the defense team?" asked Ben. "I am," said Grandfather. "I know this land better than anyone here." No one challenged him on the subject. Most just nodded their heads in agreement. "All right," said Mika. "Gear up and get ready to roll. Tracker teams, stealth and speed are your allies tonight. Travel as light as you possibly can. Take only the weapons that you need to keep fighting until the others can reach you." The group started grabbing gear. Doc took off his plate carrier and tossed it on the table. "Might as well drop that," he said, frowning. "It's going to slow me down." "I'm afraid so," agreed Will, taking off his own plate carrier. "Don't carry too much ammo, either." "Oh, this just keeps getting better and better," grumbled Doc. Will grabbed 2 cold steel tomahawks and a large belt knife. He kept his trusted Guncrafter Industries Hellcat X2 Government 9mm, along with 4 extended magazines. Next came Beowulf with another 6 magazines. Hanging Beowulf on the single-point sling, he picked up a spear and hefted the weight. "I think this'll do," he said, smiling. "No thanks," said Doc. "No offense, but I don't want to get that close to those damn things." Doc loaded up his own Noveske AR and 10 magazines. They were lighter than the Beowulf mag, so he wanted a few more. Added to that was one knife, one tomahawk, and his own SIG P320 compact. He only had 4 magazines for it, and he took them all. Added to that were 2 big medical kits and a rucksack. "Well, that's it then," said Doc. "Much more and we won't be able to run. With our cold weather gear, we're going to be pushing it anyway." "Yeah, about that cold weather gear," said Mika. "I'm thinking some thermal underwear beneath the buckskins is about it. Once we get moving, we won't notice the cold." "You might not," replied Doc, chuckling, "but I'll be freezing my nuts off." Everyone laughed at that. "The NOAA weather forecast is calling for sub-zero temperatures tonight," said Sarah. "Good thing I have gloves and thermal socks." "Good call," said Mika. "All right, everyone," said Grandfather. "It'll be dark soon. Let's get ready." They all quickly finished grabbing their weapons and other gear and then headed upstairs. Waiting for them was a snack of fresh fry bread with honey. Fortified by something on their stomachs, they took their places by the doors and windows, watching for the arrival of the Olonga Doglala. They didn't have to wait for long. "Movement!" called Jason, pointing at the hillside that led to the river below them. "Well, I think we know which direction to start looking," said Will. "Unless they're deliberately trying to throw us off," said Doc. "Possible," said Mika, "but unlikely. They don't really fear us, at least not yet." "They will soon," added Will. "We will make them remember why they feared the Hatamataneo," said Ben. As more and more movement began appearing through the trees, Will could feel his pulse begin to race in anticipation. There was the expected fear of the creatures that were beginning to surround the house, but also the eagerness of the battle. The spirit of the warrior was singing in his veins. Doc was quickly double-checking his loadout on all his pistols. He knew they were all loaded, but he also knew that when in doubt, you check it out. Satisfied that the special loads had been laced with silver and ash, he glanced at Will and nodded. "Ready," he whispered. Will only nodded and then turned back to watch through the window. Jason approached carrying Will's KSG shotgun, smiling as he brought it up to his shoulder. "Hey, cuz," he said, bumping Will's shoulder. "When this is all over, I'm going to owe you a new shotgun." "Why?" asked Will, glancing at him quizzically. "Because I loaded this bitch with Dragon's Breath rounds," explained Jason. "After I run that many of them through this, it's going to ruin the barrel." "Let's just survive the night," answered Will. "We'll worry about replacing my shotgun when this is all over." "Fair enough," agreed Jason. "If we can pull this off," said Doc, "I'll buy you one myself." "What do you mean, if?" said Mika. "Personally, I don't plan on losing." "Here they come," said Ben, pointing to the trees. "Wait for it," said Grandfather. "Don't move yet." From the tree line, more than a dozen of the Olonga Doglala appeared and began moving toward the house. Although they were cautious, they were still covering the distance quickly. "Not yet," added Grandfather. The creatures crept slowly closer, inching their way cautiously toward the house. The largest of the group, a jet-black creature with eyes that were luminescent gold orbs, slowed as it sniffed the air looking for signs of danger. It was clear from the deference that was shown to it by the other creatures that this was the alpha of the pack. They could see the eyes narrow as it studied the area, warily looking around. "Come on, you son of a bitch," whispered Jason. "Just a few more steps." And then, as suddenly as they appeared, the creatures began backing away. They were sensing danger in the air. "Fuck!" hissed Jason. Before anyone could stop him, Jason shoved the door open and rushed out onto the porch. "Come on, you bastards!" he screamed, raising the shotgun into firing position. "Shit," said Mika. "Let's go!" Grandfather twisted the crank on an old-style military detonator, sending a current to the carefully concealed wires that led off into the darkness. Instantly, incendiary devices that had been concealed around the perimeter of the house lit off with radiant light. The cascading fire that erupted into the cold night air ignited hidden caches of fuel and wood and roared with the sudden flames. As the fuel ignited, it lit up a large circle that moved completely around the house within seconds. Several of the creatures leapt back in time to avoid being trapped inside the flaming circle, but most of them did not. Among those that had been trapped by the fire was the massive jet-black alpha wolf. Letting forth with an undulating war cry, Jason took aim at the nearest creature and fired off the KSG with the dragon's breath round. The cone of burning zirconium zircaloy belched forth like its namesake, completely engulfing the creature in white-hot searing flames. Taking up the war cry, the others burst forth from the house and joined into the fray. Mika charged directly toward the big alpha, ignoring all the others in his path. Jason worked the pump on the big shotgun and was transitioning to another target. The roar of the flames was nearly drowned out by the screaming, shrieking howl of pain coming from the creature that had been immolated by the dragon's breath round. Even though they knew it was one of the Olonga Daglala, the sound, unnervingly, was human-like. Will snap-fired around from the Beowulf, striking the suffering creature in the head and instantly silencing the mournful howl. This time the creature stayed down. The special rounds that had been treated with silver and white ash had done their designed purpose. They all now knew that these creatures could be killed. "Die, you bastards!" screamed Jason, aiming at another of the creatures. Jason didn't see the creature that leapt out of the darkness behind him. He was too focused on his next target to see the danger until it was far too late. Fortunately for him, Grandfather was watching over him. Taking quick aim with the Sharp's buffalo rifle, he fired one of the massive 52 caliber 475 grain projectiles, speeding toward the creature. It struck just below the creature's left arm, exploding through the rib cage into the chest cavity, completely obliterating the heart and destroying the lungs as it erupted out the other side with the inevitability of a juggernaut. The beast sailed harmless past Jason, landing in a heap beside him, its death spasms causing the legs and arms to twitch uncontrollably as it died. The light faded from the creature's eyes as it still reached feebly out toward Jason with a single-minded intent of rending his flesh. As Mika approached the big alpha, he launched a series of furious blows. Using a combination of attacks with a tomahawk and a long-bladed knife, the big alpha easily avoided the blows and began to stalk slowly around Mika. Grim determination showed on Mika's face, but there was a resignation there too. He now understood that he couldn't beat the big alpha. What was far worse was that it was clear that the alpha knew it too. Fainting low, the alpha lunged toward Mika's left side. Mika moved to parry the attack, only to be knocked over backward by the massive backswing of the creature's right hand. Mika hit the ground and rolled several times before coming to a stop on his stomach, and Mika began forcing himself onto his hands and knees, but his tomahawk and knife were now nowhere to be found. They were both seen flying off into the darkness from the force of the blow, and through his blurred vision he could see the massive shadow of the alpha looming over him. The low growl emanating from the beast sounded almost like mocking laughter, and in an instant the beast struck Mika with a fist that landed with the force of a jackhammer. Mika was driven back into the dirt. His consciousness was beginning to fade. Rolling painfully onto his back, he stared up at the creature that was slowly approaching him, confident in an easy kill. "Go on," screamed Mika. This time the low rumble was menacing laughter. There was no mistaking it this time. "Pa," murmured the creature with a mouth clearly not designed for speech. "There, tick." Mika forced himself up onto his elbows and tried to clear his vision. He wanted to look death in the eyes and meet his end with his death song on his lips. He would meet his ancestors with his head held high. From his left, a screaming war cry erupted, causing the creature to pause its attack. As Mika's vision cleared, he could see Will Grey Eagle running toward the beast with a pistol clenched in both hands, bringing it to a firing position. As the big alpha turned to square off against the new threat, another voice rose above the roar of battle that was occurring all around them. Mika smiled as he recognized the voice. And while it certainly wasn't a First Nations war cry, it was every bit as fierce. "Die, motherfucker!" screamed Doc, running and firing his SIG P320. Doc stitched 4 rounds into the creature, causing it to roar in agony and arch its back as it spun toward him. Will took the opportunity to open fire with his Hellcat X2, and firing with the law enforcement-style two-handed grip, Will ran through what was called the Mozambique drill. 2 to the chest and 1 to the head. Although the body shots caused it pain, it was the headshot that really changed things. Will could see where it had taken a chunk of scalp from the right side of its head and scored it into the bone, but it had not penetrated the brain. With the roar that they all felt in their chests, the big alpha leapt through the flames and into the Stygian darkness beyond. Within the span of a heartbeat, the other creatures followed suit and retreated through the fire. Heaving from exertion, Will surveyed the damage. 3 of the Hatamataneo were down. There was Mika, Thomas, and Jacob. None of them were in any shape to continue fighting. The bodies of 4 of the creatures lay dead around them. There were numerous spots that were glistening in the firelight where large amounts of blood had been spilled. Despite the damage, the creatures had escaped, but there was now doubt for the first time if they had made it very far. "We hurt them," said Grandfather. "They will not forget this lesson, but they will also want revenge." "There won't be a next time," said Will, grabbing his gear. "Tracker teams, let's move." "Mika's down," said Joseph. "Then follow me," said Will. "There's a blood trail and we can follow it. Let's go." Jason grabbed a 5-gallon bucket from the porch and extinguished a section of the fire. Will sprinted through the opening with Doc, Joseph, and Kaylee and Sarah right behind him. "Grab your gear and follow them," said Jason. "I'll take care of the wounded." "I'm surprised you don't want an old man to stay behind," chided Grandfather. "After what I saw tonight," replied Jason, "you don't need the help. And besides that, you're like 10 times the tracker I am. They're all counting on you being able to find them before the creatures do." "Let's move," said Grandfather, nodding grimly at Jason. You are listening to Apex Predator, Wolf Moon. Written by D.A Roberts. Read to you by Cameron Buckner. Print copyright by Douglas Roberts. Audio production copyright by Cameron Buckner. Reproduction of this audio in any way is prohibited by U.S. copyright laws without written approval. Stay tuned to the Dixie Cryptid channel, codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle.